It was supposed to be just another night in the sky. July 11th, 1981. The stars above Los Angeles shimmered with that hazy glow only the California coast could offer. Somewhere beneath them, at a dimly lit private airstrip outside Van Nuys, four young musicians boarded a sleek, white Gulfstream II-jet, an aircraft meant to carry them into the next chapter of their rising stardom. But that chapter was never written. The band was called Midnight Mirage, a name that would soon carry a very different meaning. Their destination was Tokyo, Japan, where thousands of eager fans were waiting for the opening night of their first international tour. The jet was fueled, the crew experienced, the flight path carefully charted. There were no signs of distress, no signs of danger. Just four bandmates, a small flight crew, and a cabin full of instruments, notebooks, and dreams. The jet lifted off just after 11:40 p.m. Pacific time. The final radio contact came minutes later. Routine, calm, uneventful. Midnight Mirage en route to Narita. Clear skies. Estimated arrival, 14 hours. That was the last time anyone heard from them. Somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, the plane vanished. Not crashed, not exploded. Vanished. No mayday, no wreckage, no signal. Just silence, like a song cut off mid-chorus. For weeks, the US and Japanese governments launched one of the most extensive air and sea searches in history. Dozens of planes scoured the skies. Naval vessels combed thousands of square miles of ocean. Satellites were retasked. Nothing. Not a seat cushion, not a shoe, not a single clue. In the days that followed, fans held vigils, lighting candles beneath concert posters and spray-painted murals. Radios across the world played Echoes at Dawn, the band's haunting breakout single, on loop. And then slowly disbelief turned into obsession, because this wasn't just a crash. It was something stranger, something colder, something that didn't make sense. Why did the flight vanish just minutes after takeoff when it hadn't even reached international airspace? Why was there no radar anomaly, no black box ping, no distress signal bouncing from the emergency beacon? Even aircraft with catastrophic failures left behind something. But Midnight Mirage left behind nothing, except questions. And then, the rumors began. Some said it was pilot error, others said sabotage. A few whispered darker things, government experiments, cult interference, or even supernatural involvement. The theories spiraled, each more unbelievable than the last. But all anyone knew was this. Four young artists with a limitless future boarded a plane one night and simply never arrived. And for 19 years, that was the end of the story, until a sonar blip on a routine Navy operation brought it all roaring back. Because in the year 2000, the ocean finally gave something back, a discovery that would rewrite the mystery, raise even more questions, and change everything we thought we knew about what really happened that night. You said, next heading. ChatGPT said, 2:30 to 10. Voiceover, who were they? The band called Midnight Mirage. Before the disappearance, before the mystery, before the endless speculation, there was just the music, and four young souls bound together by a sound they were still discovering. Midnight Mirage wasn't born in a recording studio or stitched together by corporate labels. They came from garages, from dive bars, from the ragged edges of California's underground scene. They were misfits with instruments, dreamers with distortion pedals. And by 1981, they had become one of the fastest rising rock bands on the West Coast. It started with Danny Cross, the frontman. Charismatic, brooding, and often shirtless on stage, Danny was the kind of figure you couldn't look away from. With that signature streak of white in his jet black hair and a voice that hovered between a whisper and a scream, he was both angel and anarchist. But those who knew him personally said he was also deeply haunted. Danny had demons, and they came out in his lyrics. Cryptic verses, references to dreams, death, and disappearing. Next was Tyler Reese, the band's lead guitarist. While Danny stole the spotlight, Tyler built the stage beneath him, layered, swirling guitar work that critics called hypnotic. Tyler rarely spoke in interviews. He let his instrument do the talking. He was soft-spoken, reclusive, and known for spending hours alone with his guitar in complete darkness. Some claim Tyler had synesthesia. He saw sound as color, and that's why the band's music shimmered with such strange, surreal emotion. Then came Rick Rhino Martinez, the drummer. Loud, explosive, pure chaos in human form. Rick was the wild card, known for smashing his drum set at the end of shows and leaping into the crowd, sometimes injured, always unbothered. Off stage, he lived fast and hard, but his rhythms, precise, primal. He gave Midnight Mirage its heartbeat. And finally, Elena Quinn, the bassist and the band's quiet backbone. The only female in the group, Elena brought balance. Her lyrics shaped many of the band's songs, including Echoes at Dawn and Last Exit to Somewhere. Elena was thoughtful, introverted, and obsessed with symbolism. She kept detailed journals, often filled with poetry and strange sketches. Some believe it was Elena who gave the band its name, and that the phrase Midnight Mirage came from one of her earliest poems about dreams you can't hold on to. Together they were magic, a perfect storm of talent, dysfunction, and raw, unfiltered energy. Their first EP was self-produced, distributed on cassette tapes, and sold out of the back of a van. But it was enough to catch the attention of indie producer Victor Langston, a former sound engineer turned talent scout who specialized in discovering the weird ones. Langston signed them to his experimental label, and within 6 months, they had a record deal and a single climbing the college radio charts. Their debut album, Desert Children, dropped in early 1981 and exploded. It was unlike anything on the airwaves. Echoing guitar tones, strange time signatures, lyrics that made listeners rewind over and over again. The album defied classification. Too moody for pop, too melodic for punk, too poetic for hard rock. But it worked. Critics were divided. Some hailed them as the next Pink Floyd. Others dismissed them as esoteric noise. But the fans were obsessed. Concerts sold out in hours. Bootleg recordings circulated like sacred texts. And rumors spread fast about hidden messages in songs, occult symbols and cover art, and a growing sense that Midnight Mirage wasn't just a band. It was something bigger. Their most famous song, Echoes at Dawn, hit number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100 just 3 weeks before they vanished. A 6-minute ballad that starts with ambient noise and ends in a wall of sound, it was described as a sonic hallucination. The lyrics, especially in retrospect, would become legendary. If I vanish in the silence, don't look for me in the light. I'll be somewhere in the static, in the echo of the night. Was it prophecy, coincidence, or just a sad twist of fate? Fans began to wonder if the band knew something, if there was an awareness, even subconsciously, that their story would be short and shrouded in mystery. The members themselves didn't help. In rare interviews, they spoke about death as a doorway, dreams as real places, and time as a broken clock. It was Danny who once said, on a radio broadcast just days before the Japan tour, "We're not trying to be remembered. We're trying to be felt, even if it's just for a moment." No one knew that moment was already ending. By July of 1981, Midnight Mirage had everything: fame, a platinum record, and a sold-out tour awaiting them overseas. But they would never step on that Tokyo stage. They would never play another chord, never write another lyric, never speak to the public again. Because within hours of their private jet lifting off, they would be gone. The night of July 11th, 1981, began like any other in the chaotic rhythm of rock and roll. The band had just wrapped a 3-day recording session in Burbank, laying down demos for what would have been their second album, tentatively titled The Glass Horizon. Their producer, Victor Langston, said the band was exhausted but electric, burnt out yet oddly energized, as if they knew these songs mattered more than they let on. They were scheduled to depart Van Nuys Airport at 11:15 p.m. on a privately chartered Gulfstream II jet. It was a short drive from the studio, and according to hangar staff, the band arrived just after 10:30. There were no paparazzi, no groupies, no label execs, just the 4 members, 2 pilots, a flight attendant, and a cargo hold filled with instruments, stage gear, and handwritten notebooks. Elena Quinn was the last to board. Witnesses recall her pausing at the stairs, turning back to glance at the sky before whispering something no one could hear. Then she disappeared into the cabin. At 11:41 p.m., the jet was cleared for takeoff. Radar tracking shows the plane climbing normally, heading west over the Pacific Ocean in a routine ascent. They reached 32,000 feet. Weather was calm, visibility excellent. The final radio transmission was logged at 12:04 a.m. Gulfstream 212 en route. Flight path stable. Clear ahead. Midnight Mirage on board. See you on the other side. Those were the exact words, and that chilling phrase, "see you on the other side," would be endlessly analyzed in the years to come. 6 minutes later, the plane vanished from radar. No gradual signal loss, no transponder error, just gone. Air traffic control attempted contact multiple times. No response. Emergency protocols were triggered at 12:22 a.m. By dawn, the U.S. Coast Guard had dispatched search planes, and the Japanese Civil Aviation Bureau was on alert. Naval fleets in the Pacific were pinged for possible assistance. For the next 10 days, an international air and sea search effort combed over 75,000 square miles of ocean. They found nothing. Not a wing, not a life vest, not a body, not even oil slicks. It was as if the plane had been plucked out of existence mid-flight. Aviation experts were baffled. Commercial airline crashes left trails. Even explosions at altitude left debris fields. But this was clean, surgical, quiet. Some theorized catastrophic failure, a total systems collapse. But even then, emergency beacons were designed to deploy automatically, and they didn't. Satellite imaging caught nothing. The black box never transmitted. Investigators were forced to file the incident under an unprecedented classification, unresolved disappearance over international waters. And with no answers, speculation grew. Conspiracy theorists suggested hijacking or government interference, but there were no ransom notes, no political motives. Paranormal circles swirled with talk of sky voids and dimensional slips. Some fans believed the band had faked their own deaths to escape fame and start anew in some secret commune in South America. But none of it made sense. Not with their careers at their peak, not with their music unfinished, not with their lives half-lived. What stung most was the lack of closure. Parents left with no graves to visit, fans with no final words, bandmates with no final show. Just a hole, silent, deep, and bottomless. It wasn't until 19 years later, when a U.S. Navy recovery vessel ran a sonar sweep during a training exercise in a remote trench of the Pacific, that the silence began to break, and what they found should not have been there. For nearly 2 decades, the ocean kept its secret. By the time the year 2000 arrived, the disappearance of Midnight Mirage had faded into legend, half memory, half myth. Most believed the band was simply lost forever, like so many before them, swallowed by the Pacific's vast indifference. But on a quiet August morning, during what was supposed to be a routine training mission, the U.S. Navy stumbled onto something it was never meant to find. It began aboard the USNS Calypso, a deep-sea research and recovery vessel conducting sonar sweeps along the western edge of the Mariana Trench. The operation was standard, testing new unmanned underwater vehicles and sonar mapping software. There were no expectations beyond routine data collection. At precisely 6:17 a.m. local time, the ship's sonar officer picked up an anomaly. At first, it appeared to be just another ghost signal, possibly volcanic debris, maybe a rock shelf collapse. But as the signal stabilized, it revealed something unusual, a sleek, metallic shape with angular contours. Not natural, not geological, something artificial, something man-made. The object was resting at a depth of over 12,000 feet, far deeper than where the Midnight Mirage flight had been expected to disappear, and well outside the last known radar contact zone. Per protocol, a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV named Deepfire 3, was dispatched to investigate. Equipped with high-definition cameras, mechanical arms, and sonar scanners, the ROV descended into the dark, crushing pressure of the deep. What it found stunned the crew. There, embedded nose first in the ocean floor, was a jet, intact. preserved, as if time itself had stopped. The tail number, G212-LX, matched the official records. It was the missing Gulfstream II, the same plane that vanished without a trace in 1981. But it wasn't just the condition of the wreck that shocked everyone. It was how untouched it appeared. There was no evidence of a high-speed impact, no explosion damage, no signs of corrosion consistent with 19 years under salt water. In fact, the paint was still visible on the fuselage. The windows were sealed. The engines looked clean. It was as though the plane had only just landed, gently, on the seabed. And then came the real horror. The ROV's external floodlights moved toward the cockpit. Inside, still seated in the pilot's chair, was a skeleton, still dressed in uniform, still buckled in. Next to him, another skeletal figure, presumably the co-pilot. The third seat behind them was empty. The ROV maneuvered along the fuselage. Through a broken side window, its cameras peered into the main cabin. 4 more figures, still strapped into their seats. No visible trauma, no chaos, just stillness. A snapshot frozen in time. The configuration matched the seating chart filed for the 1981 flight. The 4 figures were almost certainly the members of Midnight Mirage, and they looked like they had been dead for days, not decades. When the footage was played back on the Calypso's main screen, there was silence among the crew. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitlock, reportedly whispered, "It's like they just got here." An emergency communication line was opened to Naval Command. Within 24 hours, the Discovery was classified. The wreckage coordinates were sealed. Recovery was delayed under the guise of operational readiness testing. But word began to leak, first in whispers, then in anonymous reports to music blogs and conspiracy forums. By October 2000, an independent journalist named Mark DeLuca published the first article to suggest that Midnight Mirage's jet had been found, but that the condition of the wreck didn't match the timeline. He was silenced quickly. Some say he was sued into silence. Others claim he disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, a recovery team was sent down in mid-November under a joint Navy and NOAA task force. Their mission was to retrieve the bodies, preserve any evidence, and quietly bring the remains to the surface. What they recovered only deepened the mystery. The flight logbook was found in the cockpit, its ink completely legible. The final entry was dated July 11, 1981, as expected. But what shocked investigators was a second entry, dated July 30, 1981, 19 days after the plane had vanished. The handwriting matched the pilot's. It read, "Holding at altitude, all instruments normal, cabin secure, no movement outside, passengers sleeping, awaiting instruction." Awaiting instruction, the implication was terrifying. Was the plane still flying weeks after it vanished? If so, where? Then came the audio tape. Found in the band's cargo crate was a cassette recorder, one used by Elena to record song ideas and lyrical fragments. The tape was badly degraded, but one section was recoverable. In it, you can hear her voice hushed, almost frightened. "It's been 5 days, I think. We're not sure anymore. There's no sun, no turbulence, just this hum. It's like the plane is gliding. Danny says we haven't moved. Tyler won't open his eyes. Rick keeps tapping the same beat on the wall, over and over, and I can't remember what we were singing." Then silence, then static, then something else, barely audible. A voice, not hers, whispering a single phrase, "Still in the static." The very same line from Echoes at Dawn. Was it a coincidence? Or something more? The tape ended abruptly after that. Investigators passed it to a sound lab for analysis, but within weeks the lab claimed it had lost the original recording. "Mislabeled and destroyed," they said. Convenient. Back aboard the recovery vessel, strange problems began to surface. Electronics failed at random. Power flickered. Several crew members reported vivid nightmares and strange auditory hallucinations. Songs playing faintly from nowhere. Voices whispering lyrics no one remembered writing. One diver refused to go back under after claiming he saw a face looking out from the jet window, blinking at him through the deep. Medical reports dismissed these incidents as pressure-induced stress, But those on board knew better. There was something wrong with that plane, something unnatural. The official report, eventually declassified in part, stated that the aircraft had likely descended at a shallow angle and depressurized mid-flight, causing death by hypoxia. A tidy explanation, easy to digest. But the condition of the bodies, the timestamp in the flight log, the tape recording, none of it aligned with that narrative. And so the silence returned. The wreck was reburied beneath classified layers, the media distracted with newer, shinier tragedies. But those who had seen the footage, those who had touched the jet's icy fuselage, those who heard the hum in the deep, they knew something the world wasn't ready to understand. That Midnight Mirage didn't just vanish, they crossed into something else, something waiting, something still humming beneath the Pacific. And whatever happened on that flight, it left a crack in the veil, a sound in the static, a story unfinished. In the weeks following the discovery of the Gulfstream II, the official narrative remained eerily sterile. According to military reports, the plane had simply descended at an oblique angle and came to rest relatively undisturbed on the seafloor. No further elaboration, no press conferences, no photographs released, just silence. Again. But outside that silence, the world began to speculate. And as the eerie details leaked through cracks in the military's airtight response, the theories began multiplying like wildfire. At the center of it all was one impossible question. Where had the jet been for 19 years? The idea that the plane had crashed and remained undiscovered for nearly 2 decades was already suspect, especially considering the area had been surveyed multiple times during initial searches and by deep-sea mapping projects in the years that followed. But it was the condition of the wreck that truly shattered conventional logic. Aircrafts don't remain pristine after crashing into the ocean at speed. The deep sea corrodes everything. Pressure shatters, salt eats, life invades, but not this jet. This jet looked recent, and that opened a dark, gaping doorway for the impossible. Theory 1, the time slip. The first and most popular theory in fringe communities was the time slip or temporal displacement hypothesis. According to this view, the jet never crashed, not in the way we understand. Instead, shortly after takeoff, it entered some kind of temporal anomaly, a fold in space-time. This would explain why the radar lost it instantly, why no wreckage was found, why the black box never activated. The jet didn't descend into the ocean. It disappeared into another layer of reality. Some point to other reported disappearances in the same part of the Pacific, the so-called Devil's Triangle, the less publicized cousin of the Bermuda Triangle. Stories going back decades tell of ships losing time, instruments going haywire, and vessels vanishing without a trace. And the evidence from the Midnight Mirage flight seems to match. A log entry dated 19 days after the disappearance. A cassette recording indicating altered perception of time and space. A plane found intact, as if it had just left the runway. Could the band have spent those 19 years in another dimension, only to return lifeless when the slip closed? Those who believe this theory say the jet was ejected back into our world at a different location, gently deposited on the ocean floor as if spat out by the anomaly. But why dead? Why not returned alive? Some say human physiology can't survive the shift, that what came back were not bodies but echoes, shells returned to the wrong world. Theory 2, Government Black Project. The second theory is far more terrestrial and far more sinister. According to whistleblowers and conspiracy forums, the disappearance of the band wasn't an accident, it was an experiment. Theorists point to DARPA projects active in the early 1980s, when Cold War paranoia pushed the U.S. to experiment with experimental aviation technologies, including early stealth displacement prototypes. The theory goes like this. Midnight Mirage's private jet was somehow caught in a military test, a prototype stealth field, a radar-deflecting anomaly, or even early quantum teleportation technology. Perhaps the band's flight path intersected with an airborne test range. Perhaps the jet was deliberately targeted to see how a civilian craft would react. Of course, this theory requires a heavy dose of mistrust in government systems. which in the wake of classified experiments like MK Ultra and Project Stargate isn't too far-fetched for many. Supporters of this theory cite the Navy's swift classification of the wreck site and the silence surrounding the flight log and tape. Why weren't those items publicly released? Why was the wreck buried, both literally and figuratively, so quickly? And most damning, if the black box survived, where is it now? One alleged leak, posted anonymously on a now-defunct message board, claimed that the aircraft was held in a secret underwater containment lab for further analysis, and that only after the plane began exhibiting resonant anomalies was it buried in its original location to avoid further exposure. Whether this is fiction or disinformation remains unclear. More fringe still is the theory that Midnight Mirage had come into contact with something paranormal, something not from science or nature, but from the other side. According to this belief, the band's final album in progress, The Glass Horizon, had been inspired by a series of dreams experienced simultaneously by all four members during their tour in Asia. Dreams of a glowing sea, of music that played backward, of faces speaking in reversed whispers. Elena Quinn, according to one former sound technician, had begun incorporating reversed Gregorian chants and forbidden tones into their new demos, frequencies that didn't make sense musically, but made her claim she could see the shape of time. Another unconfirmed rumor says she met with an obscure mystic in Tokyo who told her their music was becoming a beacon, that their vibrations were opening the corridor. The day before the flight, Rick Holloway allegedly told a friend in a voicemail, "We're not flying home tomorrow. Not really. You'll see." When the plane disappeared, fans began speculating that the band had willingly crossed into a spiritual or dimensional gateway, using their music as the key. They didn't vanish. They ascended or descended into another place. The theory is supported by the eerie final lines of the cassette tape. Still in the static, some believe that Midnight Mirage tapped into something ancient and unknowable, that their harmonies opened a rift, and that the jet was caught between vibrations, disintegrating not physically but spiritually, returning only once the cord was broken. This theory is often dismissed by skeptics, but to those who have listened to the final, unreleased tracks, bootlegs smuggled from old recording sessions, the sense of otherworldliness is undeniable. Finally, there is the most skeptical theory of all, that the entire discovery in 2000 was either a misidentification, an elaborate hoax, or a case of mass delusion. Some skeptics argue the jet was simply another aircraft lost at sea, coincidentally bearing the same tail number, that the bodies inside were unrelated to the band, that the recovered tape and logbook were faked or planted. These arguments often hinge on the military's refusal to release official footage, the lack of verifiable remains, and the general unreliability of anonymous sources and secondhand reports. To this day, no government official has confirmed that the jet belonged to Midnight Mirage. No death certificates were ever issued. And the band's families? They've remained silent since the recovery. A few still claim the band is alive, living somewhere in the shadow, waiting to return. In the end, every theory leads back to the same void, the same hum in the deep, the same haunting mystery. Where was Midnight Mirage for 19 years? And what truly happened aboard that plane? The next part of this story will reveal the chilling aftermath, the strange ripple effects, the cursed music, and the unexplained disappearances of those who got too close to the truth. The world thought the mystery had ended when the jet was found, but in truth, that's when the real nightmare began. It started quietly, barely noticeable to most, a whisper on music forums, a thread buried deep in conspiracy blogs, the occasional interview clip, dismissed as too strange to be taken seriously. But piece by piece, a darker truth began to form. Whatever came back from the ocean wasn't just a plane, it brought something else with it. Let's start with the tape. After it was recovered from the cockpit of the jet, a select few government audio specialists were assigned to analyze it. Their task? Determine its authenticity and trace any potential clues to the flight's disappearance. But just days after the analysis began, the lab was shut down. One of the technicians, a young audio engineer named Cole Danner, vanished. His disappearance didn't make the news. No police report was filed. But online, a user named CD_417 began posting fragments of audio files, strange, degraded clips, claiming they were sourced from the cursed cockpit cassette. The clips were disturbing, not because of screams or impact sounds, but because of what shouldn't have been there. Beneath the hum of static, you could hear music, not played by instruments, but embedded into the static itself. Tones, rhythms, pulses. It sounded like something trying to mimic music, but getting it just wrong enough to be deeply unsettling. One clip in particular, known in underground circles as Echo Track 3, features a faint voice repeating the phrase, "We never left the climb never ends." To this day, no one knows where CD417 went. His final post read, "They're listening now. It's not safe to hear it too many times." Then silence. In 2002, 2 years after the discovery, an independent journalist named Gwen Tullis began researching the Midnight Mirage case for a book. Gwen was meticulous. She interviewed everyone she could find, former crew members, producers, classmates, even Elena Quinn's estranged cousin who worked briefly in their touring team. Her notes, later found in a storage locker in Nevada, detailed a consistent thread. Everyone who had close contact with the recovered plane experienced auditory hallucinations within 2 to 3 weeks. She documented at least 6 cases of researchers reporting a constant low-frequency tone that followed them, even in silent rooms. A few described music bleeding from walls or dreams where they were trapped inside an airplane that never lands. Gwen's final interview was with a retired naval diver named Thomas Mick Salazar, one of the first men to descend into the wreck and examine the fuselage up close. He had refused all interviews for 2 years until Gwen convinced him. He told her something chilling. "I thought I saw one of them move." When Gwen asked him to clarify, he repeated it. "Her eyes weren't closed, Elena. I recognized her. Her eyes weren't closed. She was staring right at me." That interview never made it into her book because Gwen disappeared 3 days later. The last footage of her shows her alone in a hotel lobby, clutching a recorder and whispering something over and over again. Hotel staff claimed the phrase she repeated was, "I heard it backwards. It's not a song, it's a map." Her manuscript was never published, but bootleg versions of her notes circulate online under the title, "The Mirage Curse, Notes from the Forgotten." In the mid-2000s, as digital forensics and audio restoration became more accessible, amateur sleuths began attempting to reverse engineer the cockpit tape and the alleged demo recordings from The Glass Horizon, the band's rumored final album. One group in particular, a group of music students from Portland calling themselves Project Glass, claimed to have deciphered a sonic pattern that could be used to recreate the sound corridor. They posted their findings to an obscure blog called Chords Beyond Time. The blog lasted exactly 12 hours before being scrubbed from the internet. No cached versions exist, and none of the students have been seen since. One roommate of a member, however, claims to have heard the audio pattern before it was deleted. She described it as a harmony that felt alive, like it was watching me. She said it began playing from devices that weren't turned on. She had to remove all her electronics. Then came the musicians. Indie bands intrigued by the myth of Midnight Mirage began sampling their known discography, particularly the bootleg tracks thought to have been part of The Glass Horizon. But the results were unnerving. A British DJ named Neon Float incorporated a reverse sample of Elena's isolated vocal from 1980 into a live set in Berlin. Halfway through the performance, the sound system blew out. 3 audience members collapsed from seizures. Neon Float retired from music that same year and hasn't spoken publicly since. Another band, the Choking Orchids, tried performing a reconstructed version of She Wrote the Sky in Numbers, a lost track from the band's final tour. During rehearsal, the lead singer suffered a sudden psychotic break, claiming the chords are mirrors and the mirror's open now. The band disbanded within days. At first, it all seemed like isolated incidents, but those who connected the dots began to notice a pattern. Those who listened too closely, who analyzed too deeply, who tried to resurrect what Midnight Mirage had created, began to experience strange phenomena. Audio distortion during unrelated recordings, devices turning on by themselves, dreams of being inside a crashing plane over and over again, and most chilling, sightings of a figure seated quietly in the corner of the dream cabin, watching. Some believe that the glass horizon wasn't just music, it was a ritual, a gateway, and when the band crossed over, they left it behind, open. And now anyone who gets too close risks crossing too. You might wonder, what about the families? Surely they would speak, protest, demand answers. They did, at first, but over time, their presence faded. In 2004, a cousin of Rick Holloway launched a petition to declassify the Navy's full findings. It garnered only 40 signatures before being deleted. A week later, he checked into a psychiatric facility in Tucson, Arizona. His statement on record? "They're singing to me in the walls, they won't stop." In 2008, Elena Quinn's brother posted a message on a fan forum that simply said, "It's better you don't hear it." That was his last public post. His social media accounts went dark. A living legend or a lingering curse? Now, decades after their disappearance, Midnight Mirage has transformed from a rock band into a legend. But for some, it's more than that. It's a warning. Do not listen too closely. Do not play what you don't understand. And if you find a cassette tape with no label, with the name Midnight Mirage carved faintly into the shell, burn it, because the climb never ends, and some songs are not meant to be heard. There's always one final door in every great mystery, one file that was never meant to be opened. And when it is, everything changes. That file was called Project Mirage, Declassified Level, Redacted. It leaked briefly online in 2011, posted anonymously on a deep web Naval Archive mirror that has since vanished, but not before it was downloaded, copied, and spread like wildfire across conspiracy communities. Its contents? Chilling. The file didn't just contain technical details about the jet, it held transcripts, reports, psychological evaluations, and something more sinister, intercepted communications between Navy intelligence and a private defense contractor named Soltech Oral Labs. Let's break it down. Page 4 of the leak revealed that the black box was not damaged by the crash. It was wiped, deliberately, by something inside the jet. There was no sign of a hijacking, mechanical failure, or human sabotage. But the logs reference anomalous frequency exposure consistent with infrasonic field disruption. In layman's terms, a sound so deep and powerful it could interfere with memory, orientation, and electronic systems. This matched multiple hallucination reports from those who analyzed the wreckage. The report notes, exposure time exceeded safe levels. Crew likely incapacitated through cognitive overload, origin unknown, possibly from onboard source. In other words, the sound came from within. This is where the file gets darker. In a section marked Observation Notes, double M-subject, -ELQ, a psychological profile describes Elena Quinn in the months before the crash. It mentions she underwent experimental synesthetic composition therapy with a private research entity, Soltech Oral Labs. The therapy supposedly helped her channel audio hallucinations into measurable harmonic fields. What does that mean? Soltech believed Elena's unique brain structure allowed her to hear sound in multiple dimensions. They tried to amplify that ability. They were experimenting on her, on all of them, not for medical purposes, but for weaponization. Another line reads, Subject ELQ demonstrates increasingly precise tonal manipulation, may present risk of unintended rift phenomena if uncontained. What is a rift phenomenon? We don't know, but the next few pages of the report were blacked out entirely. No redactions, just a full blackout. One of the most disturbing theories comes from a transmission log at the end of the report. It includes intercepted Navy sonar readings during the original 2000 recovery dive. Those readings describe intermittent harmonic pulses, similar to echolocation, but non-biological. These pulses didn't originate from the wreck. They were answering it. According to the final, partially decrypted log, something in the deep ocean responded to the plane as if it were a signal, a call. Whatever Elena Quinn and her bandmates recorded on that final album, The Glass Horizon, may not have been music. It may have been a transmission, and it worked. The last line in the report reads, Terminate acoustic studies. No further testing authorized. Seal all associated research. Subject MM to status, LOST. This is speculation, but it's where the myth becomes legend. Among the last pages of the leaked document is a brief note. Just 5 words, scribbled by hand, possibly by one of the Navy analysts. Quinn's still out there, listening. No context, no timestamp, no clarification, just a chilling possibility that Elena Quinn never died. That somehow, through whatever doorway they opened with their music, she stepped through. And she's still hearing us. Since that leak, the U.S. government has refused to acknowledge the existence of Project Mirage. Soltech Oral Labs no longer exists, and every known copy of the Glass Horizon, real or fake, has been scrubbed, silenced, or buried. Yet some still search, some still listen, and some believe. If the right notes are played again, the door could reopen. But the question is, who would walk back through it? And would they still be human? That ends the haunting true story of the young rock band Midnight Mirage, the plane that vanished in 1981, and the truth the ocean kept hidden for 19 years.